Hey everyone, so today we're diving into what should be a pretty simple figure in English literature, the 17th century writer Samuel Butler. But as we started digging into the source material for this explainer, we found a story that is, well, it's anything but simple. In fact, it's a genuine literary mystery.
Okay, so before we get into Butler himself, we have to talk about his weapon of choice, satire. Now, satire isn't just about making jokes. It's about using humor and irony like a scalpel to cut open and expose all the hypocrisy and silliness in society. And for a writer in 17th century England, a time of just massive political and religious chaos, it was the absolute perfect tool for the job.
All right, first things first, let's lock in our subject in time. Samuel Butler, born 1612, died 1680. You got that? His entire life happened within the 17th century. Now, these dates are absolutely crucial, so please burn them into your brain. Everything we're about to talk about hinges on this very specific lifespan.
So, who was this guy? Well, this slide gives us a great snapshot. He wasn't some aristocrat born with a silver spoon. Nope, he was a farmer's son who basically educated himself. You just know that means he had this powerful, relentless curiosity. He became this super keen observer of the world falling apart around him and poured all of that insight into his masterpiece, a satirical poem called Hudibras.
And listen, Hudibras wasn't just some poem. The source material calls it a landmark in English satire. This was Butler's signature work, the thing that would come to define not only him, but his entire era.
So what exactly made it such a big deal? Well, it's a mock heroic poem. That means he used this grand, epic style, like the ancient Greek poets, to describe this totally ridiculous, pompous knight named Hudibras. It was published in a few parts between 1663 and 1678, and it took direct aim at the Puritan movement, which had just been running England during the Civil War. It was timely, it was savage, and it was incredibly clever.
And this quote just nails it, right? It was a sharp, funny takedown of the politics and culture of his day. So far, this all adds up. We've got a 17th century writer writing about 17th century problems. Makes perfect sense.
But this is where our nice, neat story starts to completely fall apart. Because according to our source, Samuel Butler also wrote some other pretty major works. And this is where things get really strange.
Just to recap, so we are all on the same page, born 1612, died 1680. His life is locked firmly, completely inside the 17th century. Remember that. Okay, now our source also credits Butler with writing a novel called The Way of All Flesh. It's described as a semi-autobiographical critique of religious hypocrisy. Sounds like something he'd write, right? But the real question is, when was it published?
1903. Yeah, that's 223 years after he died. How is a semi-autobiographical novel published over 2 centuries after the author is gone? Something is very wrong here. But hold on, it gets weirder. Next up, another work apparently written by Butler, the philosophical novel Erewhon. This book is a critique of Victorian society and its obsession with industrialization. Victorian society, which, happened about 200 years after Butler died. And the publication date? 1872. Again, almost 2 centuries after our author passed away. The plot thickens, or maybe the timeline just dissolves.
And for our last piece of completely impossible evidence, the source also gives Butler credit for a major theological work, The Analogy of Religion, which gets into all these ideas about faith and reason during the Enlightenment. This one came out in 1736. I mean, that's only 56 years after his death, but still, it's a chronological impossibility. So what on earth is going on? We have one man with one lifespan who is somehow publishing groundbreaking work across 3 different centuries. This isn't a biography anymore. This is what we're calling the Butler paradox. I mean, this is the central question, isn't it? It just breaks logic. How could a 17th century guy making fun of Puritans also be a 19th century guy worried about robots taking over? Let's just look at how different these worlds are.
So on one hand, you've got Hudibras, a poem that's all about the religious fights of the English Civil War. And on the other hand, you have Erewhon, a novel basically about anxieties over the rise of machines after the Industrial Revolution. These aren't just from different decades, they are from entirely different universes. Let's just put it all on the table nice and clear. This shows you the scale of the absurdity. The Analogy of Religion, published 56 years after his gone. Erewhon, 192 years later, and The Way of All Flesh,
an unbelievable 223 years after he died, the timeline we're being given by the source just doesn't work. It's impossible.
So, where does that leave us? With this incredibly complicated legacy. The source material presents Samuel Butler not as a man who lived and died, but as this figure of deep, profound contradictions. A writer who somehow transcends time itself. And honestly, this might be the wildest part. The source text just sums it all up by lumping all these works together. It says Butler's contributions cover everything from 17th century satire to philosophical novels. It presents this impossible collection of work as belonging to just one guy.
So the legacy we end up with is this big collection of themes, critiquing society, exploring what it means to be an individual, the craziness of human behavior. But these themes are being pulled from books written over a 200-year span, each responding to a totally different moment in history.
And that's where we're going to end it. See, this explainer wasn't really about solving the mystery. It was about laying out the puzzle exactly as it appears in our source. And it leaves us with this final, really fascinating question. What does it mean when a person's life story, their entire legacy, becomes a paradox? And what does that tell us about how history itself is sometimes written and remembered?